You'll remember that earlier we were considering the extension to the south wing, which was made by Charles Hardy, the Victorian owner, and his architect David Brandon. This made extra space in the private accommodation on both floors, but unfortunately it also interfered seriously with one of the axes created by Dudley Digges when he decided where to put this house. In choosing this spot, on a wide expanse of hillside with a wonderful view over the river valley, Digges, as a man of Kent, would have been aware that on this slope for hundreds of years there had been pilgrims going to and fro between Hampshire, Canterbury and the Kent coast. And before that, people had passed along here since time immemorial, way back into the Stone Age. Defining this route with an avenue of chestnuts, Digges created a vista which points straight to the central courtyard at the heart of the house, where it intersects the other axis from the church. It's also been noted that the orientation of the house and the Chestnut Avenue relate closely to the position of the sun at certain times of year. From this point you can see the Victorian extension on the south wing to the left of the black downpipe adjoining the bay window. Had that extension not been built, you could from this point look right across the courtyard at the heart of the house and see the green copper roof of the turret at the far end of the front block. That was a kind of focal point from this avenue as you were walking towards the house. Having blocked that view, David Brandon, the Victorian architect, decided to put at the top corner of his extension a strange little bartizan, a small turret, which appears in this photograph. In the 1920s, Herbert Baker didn't see the point of this turret, and so he took it away, leaving the avenue without any particular focal point. Contrary to popular belief, Capability Brown, the great English landscape gardener, who, as I've already mentioned, came here in the 1770s at the invitation of Thomas Heron, was not responsible for the landscape that we see around us. Brown recommended removal of some of the terracing, part of which has been put back. But we do have the ha-ha, which he called the sunk fence and wall. Brown suggested extending it, and this, we believe, is the part which was built as a result. This extension to the ha-ha was needed because Brown had suggested the demolition of the garden walls which used to stand beside the castle. Without any such barrier to mark the edge of the garden, animals could wander from the park right up to the house itself. The garden of Dudley Digges is thought to have been terraced much as the upper levels still are today, but with more plants, some of which were doubtless introduced by his plantsman John Tredescant the Elder. In 1618, a couple of years after the house was finished, Digges and Tredescant went to Moscow at the command of King James I, taking some money on loan to the Tsar of Russia. Tredescant brought back many plants, some of which would have come here to Chilham. And so of all the plants and trees that we believe John Tredescant introduced here, we think we have only two survivors. These two mulberry trees, which are all that remains of a line of 7 down this bank. They seem to be about 400 years old, and therefore we think that they must date surely from Tredescant's time. Nearly 2 centuries later, Heron had planted here at the end of the bowling green some trees to screen the old stables. Heron's more wealthy successors, the Wildman family, having removed the old stables, considered the screen unnecessary. So the trees were felled, and those stone steps were provided at about the same time. Charles Hardy Sr. made many changes in the house. His son, Charles Stewart Hardy was more keen on making changes in the park and the garden. Here, at the end of the bowling green, where the Wildman family had open lawns, Colonel Hardy, as he was known generally, planted trees once more, and nowadays this shady spot is known as the Quiet Garden. The yew trees along the edge of the bowling green are also well known. The shaggy ones, known as Irish yews, were planted by James Beckford Wildman. He may have planted the more closely clipped ones as well, but there is evidence to suggest that these English yews, as they are called, date from Charles Stewart Hardy's time. As I have mentioned before, the top terrace was destroyed in the 1770s by Thomas Heron at the instigation of Capability Brown. It was replicated 150 years later, in the 1920s, by Sir Edmund Davis, who adorned the new structure with fine English yews. Here, below the terraces, before Capability Brown arrived, you would have seen more terraces and enclosures. Originally, there were 9 of them. Now, there are just 4. Brown suggested sweeping the lower ones away, and this stretch of rough grass is the result. Capability Brown is often credited, quite wrongly, with the landscape of the park overall, including the lake. But following his 2 visits in 1777 and 1778, all he said about the park was, "It is so well wooded that it only needs a little opening." In other words, tree felling rather than more planting. As I've mentioned already, having inherited a house to which his father had made many changes, Charles Stewart Hardy concentrated on the grounds. And behind me you can see one of the great glories of Chilham, Charles Stewart Hardy's lake. The lake was fed by natural springs, supplemented by a horse-driven water pump on an island approached by a small bridge. At the corner of his lake, Charles Stewart Hardy put a boathouse, adapting or recreating a vista laid out by James Colebrook, the banker, 140 years earlier. Colebrook had acquired Chilham from the great-grandson of Dudley Digges, to whom Colebrook had loaned large sums of money. In due course, Thomas Digges had to sell to his creditor, and Colebrook became the owner. At that time, the main road between Canterbury and Ashford passed just below the castle gardens. Colebrook thought that was too close to his grounds, so he moved the road to a quarter of a mile away from the castle and enclosed the extra parkland in a high brick wall. But he enjoyed the view, and he wanted passers-by to enjoy the view from the valley bottom. And so he lowered 80 yards of the park wall and capped it with iron railings, so that passers-by could admire the view up the hill to his new home. At the opposite end of the vista, Colebrook adopted as his central point this buttress of white stone on the south wing of the castle. This is part of the painting made in 1860 by Emily Wildman. The buttress had been a feature of Digges's original design. In the opposite direction, beyond the park wall, this field used to be called Broadwalks, because James Colebrook made it an avenue flanked by lime trees leading down towards the bank of the River Stour a quarter of a mile away. There stood another boathouse, positioned like Hardy's lakeside one on the central axis of Colebrook's vista, which stretched half a mile up the hill to the castle itself. Today, this pump house stands where the old boathouse used to be. Its diesel engine superseded the horse pump on the island in the lake, which we looked at just now. Around 1860, Emily Wildman, who lived at the castle, made this painting of the view from the top terrace, showing Colebrook's vista nearly 150 years after he created it. There in the distance you can just make out the river and the railing on the park wall, near which, a decade or so later, Charles Stewart Hardy dug his lake and built his boathouse. This is the old road between Canterbury and Ashford as realigned by James Colebrook in the 1720s. On the right we have the park wall with its railings, and on the left the broad walks going down to the river. Here, at the central point of his vista, Colebrook provided a lay-by at the side of the road where the ladies and gentlemen could park their carriages and admire the views in either direction. Surely this 18th century lay-by could claim to be one of the first in England. So the road between Canterbury and Ashford used to run along here, and the road from Canterbury to Maidstone used to run up the hill over there. The Woolpack was located ideally where the two roads converged. But in the days of James Beckford Wildman, this handy arrangement was changed. The road between Canterbury and Ashford was moved to the far side of the river, and the road to Maidstone was moved beyond the confines of the village over there. All this happened over 100 years before the motor car became a nuisance. And as a result, the peace and quiet of Chilham and its historic beauty have been preserved to this day. I believe that Chilham owes a great debt to James Beckford Wildman. But I hope that he compensated the tenant of the Woolpack for the loss of business. And so, leaving the old road between Canterbury to Ashford down here beside the Woolpack, the road to Maidstone worked its way up to the top of the hill and across the square and over to Taylor's Hill over there and down, and that is where our film began. But before we close, I'd like to take you across to the church and show you where Sir Dudley and Lady Digges lie to this day. And so from here, at the top of the church tower, we conclude our tour. This view encapsulates the essence of Chilham, which in 1936 was described by the writer Arthur Mee as Old England at her very best.